They say we should have known better than to fall so deep down into this rabbit hole we found. And I was thinking.
Hi, this is Nikolai, and you're listening to my dad, Rafal, co-host James Jardine, and featuring Mr. Jim Tiller on the one and only Down the Security Rabbit Hole podcast. Plug in, listen up, and enjoy.
Deep into this pool of regrettable situations. Pitch black, think back to the last time that we were happy.
All right. Well, good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. Welcome down to Security Rabbit Hole, to another edition of the Down to Security Rabbit Hole podcast coming up on 700. The world is exciting. The time is now. And, you know, I am super excited because the man that's my guest today, Alex, how long have we tried to schedule this?
Years.
I was going to say, it's not unfair to say years, but you've had some jobs.
It could be as much as a decade, really.
Because you've had some jobs that have prohibited you from being a public speaker. We'll get to that. But Jim, welcome back. Good to have you again.
I know it's good. I know it's great. Fantastic. I'm looking forward to this. This is going to be fantastic.
So today's episode has to do with kind of deliberate leadership. And I titled this explicitly because my guest today has been in cyber, it's fair to say, a damn long time. Spent a lot of time in a critical part of our industry, has done some incredible work, and is still largely in the leadership chair, but I'm going to let him introduce himself. Mr. Hutton, please tell the good people who you are and what you do.
Well, Ralph, Jim, thank you for having me. My name is Alex Hutton, CISO at a mid-sized bank, and I'm thrilled to be here. It's been a long time coming, and I'm just excited to talk to you. Long-time listener, first-time caller.
All right. Well, it's good to have you aboard. Give me a little sense of the career arc you've had. Like, what did you study? Like, did you go to college for being a CISO? I don't think you did. It wasn't a thing when we were back in school. What's your degree, and what did you like start out doing? And then what did you think you were going to be when you grew up? And then like, how did you get there?
My degree was in finance because I thought my future was in real estate, but I happened to know what this internet thing was in 93, 94. And one of the first public internet service providers came calling. And I knew what a T3 was. I could talk intelligently about frame relay and even what the world with ATM might be like and so on and so forth. Internet protocol, right? Because I was kind of a bit of a nerd. I did well in school because I actually reverse engineered the application, the little program that they use to do the capstone project.
Nice.
But so I interviewed, and because I'd been on the internet, I thought, well, this will probably be a big thing, this internet thing, and maybe I should pursue that as a career. And they got me on board. They liked what I had to say. They said, actually, you know what you're talking about, which I didn't. We sell an internet line for $1,000 a month, $12,000 a year. We could sell one of these firewall things and make like $30,000 on a $50,000 sale, pure profit, selling Gauntlet or Accent Raptor or whatever it was at the time. Morningstar Technologies, there's one for long-time security people from back in the day. And if somebody knew how to sell it. So your job is to figure out what these firewall things are, why customers need them, and how to get them into our enterprise accounts. Go for it. And so that's kind of how I got into security. Have had a couple of startups, product startups, consultancies. Around the financial crisis, I kind of went corporate, went to Verizon, part of the DtSR team there.
Yep, I remember that.
Left there to go into basically banking. So around 2010, 2011, I guess, started down this path in banking and security leadership.
Okay. So you've been the time that you've been in the banking sector, you've led teams and been in some of the, like, it's not hard to Google you, right? Some of the most, I would say, high pressure financial environments. As we said before we hit record, companies that make and move markets. What's the culture like in those places? And talking strictly from what is security seen as? Because there's a lot of misconceptions that in high stakes financial, that security is the center of everything, or it's very important. It gets infinite amounts of money. You can do whatever you want. Dispel that for me.
I don't know that so I will dispel they have infinite amounts of money, even though our CEO would go on CNBC and say they're unconstrained, and then we have 57 phone calls. What that really means is, look, if our CISO can we've had the experiences, and if our CISO comes to me and says there's a clear and present danger, we will do what it takes to protect Western civilization at large, right? One of the fun
and that's
things
not hyperbole, by the way.
No, it's not. It's not. Well, I'll give you an example, right? How many times did the CEO of our large bank go to the White House a year? Right? That's a finite number, maybe half a dozen. I don't know off the top of my head, but I will tell you that 2 or 3 times it was with the CISO. Right? Huh. He's not going to the White House with the head of consumer lending. He's not going to the White House with, the chief data officer to talk about data governance, right?
Yeah.
Like and what I like about financial services is there is a legitimate belief that the safety of the sector is important, right? Mm-hmm. There's like FSI-SAC, information sharing, in many ways has been leading and continues to lead. John Denning does a great job with FSI-SAC. Continues to lead the way in terms of making sure that the sector is healthy, and in no small way that helps, in my opinion, our vocation, which is something I love to death, making sure that we're healthy and that financial services security departments contribute to the greater whole. That's really important, and I it's not hyperbole. I truly believe that's the case. Now, that said, right, there are limits. It isn't just a giant throw money at everything. It's a business. They're all businesses, and things have to make sense. And that's where risk is, and understanding risk management is really important.
All right, because you said it, now I have to follow up. Everybody at some point mentions risk management. I think the financials have a much different view of risk management than any other category of CISO, except for maybe like the Pentagon and those types of places.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
You guys, like, in the financial sector, I think risk is much better calculated formulaically than anywhere else. Do you agree?
Yes and no.
Okay.
So there's the wonderful story behind FAIR as a risk methodology that Jack Jones will tell you if listeners haven't heard. Is he's the newly minted CISO at a large insurance company, and he walks into a meeting with the CFO and the rest of the executive committee to ask for his budget. And he says, well, we need to do this, and we've got these compliance things that we've got to do, and we've got to, this sort of control weakness out there that we need to address. And, they sat there fairly nonplussed and said, this is neat, Jack. How much risk do we have? And he said, well, geez, huge insurance company. Lots. Like, what do you mean? And then he dawned on him almost in real time. These guys deal in risk every day. Every day. Like, this is like such a mature way of thinking about the subject space that he's pretty much got to be able to talk their language in terms of risk measurement and risk management. And that's how FAIR is one of the earlier, if not the first, forms of loss distribution analysis for cyber came about. I will argue today, and I don't think it was the case in 2005, 2006, but today, through no small part, because we have things like NIST CSF and PCI and GLBA and HIPAA and security programs and a list of good intentioned and best practices that we need to follow. Today, we're not measuring it well and anywhere. And here's why. The loss distribution is great, and it can be a useful tool in prioritization. Audit and audit findings that give me a high, medium, low risk, right? And align me to compliance programs, that's great. But in banking especially, you see your cyber risk and your technology risk and your regulatory risk is two separate risk silos. I have to manage both as a CISO, but they're two separate risk silos with two independent tolerances decided by the board. My job on the cyber risk side is to make sure that I'm doing both. Now, here's where it gets fun. If you audit me, Jim, right, against NIST CSF, how would you kind of go about doing that?
Literally go through the controls?
That's right. And what would you give me at the end of it?
For CSF?
Yeah.
Whether or not those controls those controls, either the documentation, interpretation of your practices and working with your team and their understanding of those policies and procedures and practices to the management of those controls.
Exactly. And you would do a darn good job, I bet. No, exactly. No, that's exactly my point. Now let's take this and put this as an analogy. And I'm going to use for a second soccer. You can use Formula One or whatever, but I know Rafa and I, we like to talk about Polish soccer a bit when Charlotte FC had all of our great Polish players. So
Hey, World Cup's coming.
I know, I'm excited. So what you've done is you've basically said, oh, good news, you play on a regulation-sized pitch. All of your people have boots. Congratulations, they're regulation boots. They know their positions. They know not to touch the ball with their hands. They can explain the offsides rule, right? You have playbooks. They have plays. They understand what a 4-2-4 formation is and when to use it and when to be in it. You haven't told me if they're any good. You haven't told me if they're high school level. You haven't told me if they're Premier League level. You have not stated any of that. All you've said is you are ready to play a match according to the rules. And if you audit me against a standard like we talked about, that's all you've done. You've not told me if my team is any good. Now, here's where I think we're measuring wrong. What matters to me, if I think about my organization as a factory that creates widgets, security widgets, whatever that is, right? At the end of that production line, my job is to make the best, most high quality, largest volume security widgets that I can possibly make. It is to put on the field a world-class team. It is to perform well at the end of the day. It is to keep my bank safe. What measurements have you guys seen that allows me to express that? And I would argue that there aren't.
Yeah.
We don't measure. If you can't tell me how good my team is, you can't tell me whether or not I'm managing risk well.
I think I'm a big fan of the SSE CMM from way back from 1995. And then, the SE, and then the application of the capability maturity model, I think it's been somewhat distorted since then.
Yeah.
I mean, even with the DoD and the introduction of the first version of this, CMMC, they tried to use the 5 levels of maturity kind of thing. NSA and the ISACA program or not ISACA, but the IATRP program did a really good job, but it was exhaustive. I mean, companies, you to really understand how quote unquote good the team was, you had to go through months of, games.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? So you had to actually be on the front lines. And
Exactly.
even then it was an interpretation of everybody, frankly, on their best behavior. Right. So it's, I mean, Alex, I think what you're saying is exceedingly accurate and true. And I think it's a very, very difficult thing to measure. Humans are fundamentally different to measure, but you can put frameworks and try to put taxonomies around it and train to it. But there's so much. Basically, in a nutshell, there are things that get close, but if you're not really willing to take it to the full level, you're not going to get a clear metric on that. To your point,
but
exactly.
Alex, we've talked about this too. That's like using a pen test to judge how good your security is.
Yeah,
right.
This is completely crazy,
right? Because people are like, well, we've got pen tested, we passed. You're like, but did you test your company or the efficacy of the pen testers?
Right. Exactly. No, I mean, look, at my last job, I had our emerging threat. I was the executive responsible for a while for our emerging threat team. And this was when MITRE ATT&CK was coming out and all that stuff. And the first thing we did was I just put in place, thanks to, the brilliance of people like Ryan Lynn and Matt Kelly and Jameson Shears and so forth, we put in place essentially a Top Gun exercise. Threat hunting team, it's true purple team. Threat hunting team, right, and attack simulation team. With the CTI team saying, okay, this is how you emulate a kitten or a panda or a bear or whatever, right? And this quarter, we're just going to fly these Top Gun exercises and we're going to see how we did and what happened and where we can do better. Where we're not going to put resources is just as important, right? It wasn't until I really had that experience and was segmented in a sense away from our run-of-the-day malware and network security and all these other teams, but could have the ability with this large bank budget to do those things, that I went, wow.
Okay. So
what we're doing here in terms of measuring risk, there's a whole nother dimension to it that is performance-oriented, and that's really hard to do, but it is super impactful.
So hold on, what you just said something quite profound there, and I know you did it intentionally, but you kind of glossed over it. So I'm going to repeat it for those that are taking notes that didn't catch it. Let me say this differently. Many security organizations that I'm familiar with track bad activity in one lump, right? Malware is seen in the same bucket of badness as a threat actor, as an insider threat, whatever that may look like, as other vectors. What you're saying is deliberate attacker, deliberate adversary gets its own category, and that's measured, and the efficacy of controls against those simulated but very real threats is a different thing than how well you respond to malware. And I know viruses aren't a thing anymore, but malware and ransomware and those types of things, right? So now you're segmenting different parts of your security. Did I get that right?
Careful with the word segmentation, right? Because the feedback to make that successful, and I spent huge portions of my liver getting to know all of my peers and friends and trying to make my team, our teams collectively successful here.
I admit to nothing.
You don't want to say segmented. What you want to say is, look, when you scale up to a larger organization, you're going to have, the only way that you can approach that is to create this sort of factory floor that has a malware tranche, right? Or an endpoint security tranche, a network security tranche, right? And then you need some sort of look above that. The problem that we had wasn't that we didn't have a threat hunting team when I got there and we had to establish one. It was that everybody did threat hunting, but they did it within their own segment, right? And it's very difficult to do when you're operating at scale. And so to add this performance layer and to interact with all these other teams or segments, right? That was very informative. And again, right, reinforce the whole, like, if we don't understand how well we perform, we can only say that we have the trappings of a professional team. We cannot say that we are a professional team.
Okay.
And I like the maturity model. I think that's great. I think that approach is great. A lot of what you said makes a lot of sense, but it feels like it's back when GLBA first came out, right? And risk assessments were important. We're all dealing with Octave S, and all these other like kind of rudimentary. Well, it's medium if it feels like this, or it's high.
Oh
if
my
it
goodness.
feels like that. And it was really just an extension of vulnerability scanning more than it was actual deep thought about risk.
It's interesting because I want to point out a couple things and just build on the rhythm and the theme that you're building is there's frameworks for everything. It's just how you apply them and look how you create a lens effect with these frameworks. So do you want to know how good your people are? You have to look at them through a certain lens, or are you taking a checkbox exercise, right?
Yeah.
And I think the point about the CMM that was interesting back in the 90s was it gave you a framework, but everybody was marking themselves level 3. We're level 3, we're level 4, that kind of stuff. And I'm like, well, wait a second. So, but it was also predicated on the fact that if you had all these processes and people understood and practiced those processes, and you had an improvement mechanism, that it meant you had smart and capable people that were empowered with technology, right? And it was difficult to maintain anything like that in an environment. So we just kept falling back to the easiest thing. How many vulnerabilities are there, right? And that's why pen testing just exploded and has been that way for so long, to a little bit to Ralph's point. But I would say is, and you brought up something earlier, just to go back, not to go back, but just real quickly to kind of, you skipped across risk appetite so fast. And I think when we talk about the art of security, and it is a great deal of art, even though we try to build a tight science around it, the risk appetite part of the equation is a completely different animal. And I dare I say, Alex, I don't know if you agree or disagree, but it takes connecting with executive leadership and being in that room to understand what they think their appetite is and understand how they react to different things. So maybe, just your 2 second or however long you want to spend. I'm very curious about, how this all plays into like identifying appetite, or is that even an important thing to you?
Oh no, it's wicked important to me. So I'll give you some, both as a consultant and as a practitioner, views of this. So the appetite, I've seen a lot where the appetite statements are on paper. But what really happens is the appetite of whoever holds the purse strings actually reigns. And that's both ways, right? Both overindulgent and underindulgent in against the appetite. I've seen where organizations will use it as an excuse one way or the other, rather than a guiding principle to have an adult level discussion about what's the best thing for the organization. For me, it's very powerful to bring that up. And I do it, my team will tell you I do it quite often. Because if you get, especially in banking, I don't know if you guys understand, or your listeners will understand the 3 lines of defense in banking, but it's a thing. You've got the first line of defense, which is people like me, and we have to understand our risk and we have to act against it. The second line of defense, which is typically enterprise risk management, their job is to challenge whether or not I understand and am doing a good job against my risk. And then the third line of defense is audit, which is supposed to make sure everybody's doing their job, right? If there's a risk issue at a bank, all 3 lines of defense will get involved. Like I was cloud security executive at my last bank, and we had to define cloud security and governance, and all 3 lines of defense had to work together. You can imagine that could be 60 people, on a Teams call, easily, without batting an eye. Each of them, graciously thinking that they are very self-important, and they probably were. And they all bring their own risk tolerance to the table. And it's subjective, and it's amorphous, and it's not easy to quantify. But they all have their own risk tolerance that they're bringing to that conversation. And unless you can say, look, our risk tolerance here is moderate, even as kind of squishy as that moderate statement is, it allows you to either bring somebody who is willing to accept more risk in the conversation down, or somebody who's not willing to accept risk up. And that's important, because you just get to ask the collective hive mind, are we managing to a moderate risk tolerance right now or not? Right? and then some consensus mechanism will give in. So for me, it's been a very important tool. Now, there are people that do it much like incredibly well, and they have loss distributions and they do all these things. And I've been parts of organizations that do that sort of stuff. And that's really good too. And you can get very sophisticated at that if you have the resources and the desire. And that can be informative at a whole nother level. But for me, it's really just, okay, I got a lot of people. As a leader, I got to lead these people to the right thing for my organization. Having that tolerance statement allows me to drive them to that conclusion.
Yeah. So this is as you're describing this 3-tier system, right? And you say, are we managing to an acceptable, what we consider a moderate level, or a level of risk we're all in this room comfortable with? I think that's the way you describe it is effectively a group that looks at independently at what their business and their financials and makes judgment calls. Was it? I think it was you that a couple of years ago, back when I was at G, we had the financial discussion of how much, at what point have you spent too much on reducing fraud? And the naive me answer was never. It's until you've gotten it down to nothing. And then, of course, people that were in the business would be like, that's dumb. Nobody does that. That costs too much. And so this is the same discussion, I think, that carries into cyber that we don't carry into other, like finance gets it, but I don't think other parts of the industry get it. How much do you spend on security? Well, it's to get it to a level of risk where we say, if I spend more, right, to get my level of risk this much lower, I have to spend that much more, and that's not okay with me. I'm willing to take that on.
Yeah. There are various angles to this. Another angle that's interesting is risk prioritization has consequences. And you may say, everybody may go through this sort of Delphi risk process, ad hoc Delphi risk process that I described, and come saying, yeah, we're moderate risk. That's great. Well, let's say that's just, hey, 30% of the time something bad's going to happen. Guess what? Sometimes that means 30% of the time something bad's going to happen. Something bad happens. Well, now there's a consequence to that prioritization, right? And that's where human nature kind of takes over, because something bad happened. Even if you've done a really good job at describing that probability and so forth, right? The fact of the matter is people are having bad days, and it's because of cybersecurity, and there are consequences to that. But the consequence can tend to come back against the security department, not the fact that, no, we can prove that we manage, even through glossy loss distributions and so forth, we can prove that we manage to something. There's one more element of this that's actually really interesting. So we described, that I wanted to cover real quick if I can. We described like my whole sort of like, hey, are you a good sports team or bad sports team? The other thing that as a CISO, the job is to make, and I used that factory and production line with the widgets intentionally. Every leader, if you argue that your team's performance is the largest impact on your ability to manage risk and your risk posture as an organization, if that is true, and I think you'd have a tough time arguing against that, then you've really got to manage and prioritize folks' work. And here's what I mean. So there is the work of cybersecurity, and then there's the work about the work of cybersecurity, right? And look, I have an exhaustive GRC background. You know this. I'm not putting down GRC, but the fact of the matter is that it is very important work about the work. It is not necessarily the work itself, right? So I'm not trying to say
by the way.
I'm not trying to say one's more important than the other. I'm just saying they exist, right? And part of what is also that equation of effectiveness is how much time your organization is spending doing low value work. Also, not exactly high on the list of KRIs that people report to the board of directors universally. How many hours am I spending debugging, my endpoint product versus actually using the telemetry from it? How many hours am I spending, right, creating, responding to audit items? Now, people will do those sorts of gearing ratios and so forth. And, I've been part of exercises where people have felt like they're doing too much work about the work, and they've tried to track that. But at the end of the day, right, I think another unexploited area of effectiveness and risk management is just simply, for lack of a better term, the Deming approach to making sure that your people are effective. And there's not a ton of literature, there's not a ton out there that says that, and maybe I know that there's a lot of folks, right? I've been part of the security metrics mailing list forever, all that stuff. There are a lot of folks with a lot of good. And what I'm talking about is a MITRE ATT&CK-like framework that says, okay, this is the right ratio of work about the work to work. This is the right ratio of productivity. This is how you think about these sorts of things on the same basis, and not just Alex Hutton writing up 8 paragraphs of nonsense on a mailing list or on a blog post. Right? Like, that is missing as well. And I think that's, I'm not alone as a CISO if I say that this is endemic in our industry, is how do you make the argument that you are as optimally focused on the work as you can be. So I'll leave that with you as well, if that makes sense at all.
It does. I think there's a lot of strategy work that goes into where, particularly, like, think about how we gather data about our adversaries, right? Where are we going to put the defenses? Who are we going to get that data from? What tools are we going to use? Are they implemented properly? And then there's the work of actually using that tool set, that data, to do analysis, to figure out something to drive an action. That background work is often glossed over and sort of, or maybe even in some companies, just sort of left to the individual, and it's not well managed. Would you agree?
Yeah,
I agree 100%. When I think, Alex, as soon as you said that, it really, for me, quickly quantified one of the things that I find, I don't know, frustrating, missing, whatever the word you want to say is. There tends to be, and maybe we see it reflected in the acquisition of technology, which seems we have this, insatiable, ravenous appetite for new technology instead of just getting what we bought to work all the way through. But you know what I mean?
Yeah, no, totally. Yeah.
I think security is a bunch, maybe we're just hammers looking for nails, but I think it's a brilliant way of saying it. I was like, it shocked me awake. I was like, wait a second. That really makes sense very deep, because there's work that makes work, that makes work, that makes work. And sometimes we just focus on the last bit, or maybe really early, we're going to strategize, we're going to plan, we're going to evaluate this technology, and then we're just going to implement and then lights start blinking, you know, and then it goes and brings it all the way back to your GRC comment, right? I mean, without that governance, without sort of alignment of controls, then what's really the point? I think that's pretty insightful, frankly.
Well, I appreciate it. I bring it up not because these are the problems. These are the kind of problems that I face. I would love to sit and tell you that the majority of my strategy is about figuring out which columns of MITRE ATT&CK I'm stressing my resources against, and so on and so forth. At the end of the day, though, I feel like as a CISO, the things that I can focus on, and not like, oh, I'm enabling the business and all that other parts of my job, right? But in terms of my organization and making sure that we're doing the best, is, do I have a good team, and are they spending too much time twiddling their thumbs, right? Not wasting time, but like working on lower priority things because they are perceived as urgent, or, to your point, we did a thing, but we never really realized what the investment in that thing was. And so now it's always breaking and it's taking up our time because we're not intentional. We didn't think well about it and so forth. So it's a lot. that answers your question, Mr. Lewis. How are we doing managing risk? Now you've got my thoughts.
Yeah, so I want to end because we're coming up on time. I want to end on the topic and a question for you that probably requires more time than we have, and this is near and dear to your heart. Tell me how you measure security. You mentioned KRIs, key risk indicators, but there's lots of people. There's lots of formulas. There's lots of KPIs around security, KRIs around risk. What do you advise if you were giving advice to somebody that's taken the CISO position at I don't know, blanket, let's say their first CISO job? What do you advise people to measure? Like, what do you say is important from performance of the security team?
Well, thank you. It's a really great question. Sort of, but and backing up, right? Remember, I'm not saying that these audible things, right? Understanding whether or not you're playing with the right number of players and the pitch and you've got the right equipment and all that stuff isn't important. Start with that foundational, right? You have to know if you're ready to play the game, right? So, and that includes control health, right? So it really is, we would hire Jim and we'd have Jim come in and talk to us about this CSF, right? Where we're good and where we're not so good. And then, possibly even a maturity model. But at that point, right, you want to make sure that you can maintain that, right? Jack will talk about visibility. The two great enemies of the CISO are visibility and variability, or lack, and Jack Jones, that is. And who I learned everything from, almost. So it is making sure you have that visibility and that you understand variability in the environment and that you can manage through that on a consistent basis. Allows you to say, I have a factory, I have a team that's well-equipped. Now I can take that next step of maturity up and start measuring what they're working on and if it is of value, right? And if it's paying dividends, right? I might be spending a lot on security orchestration and automation. I might be paying some dividends with it, but I reached some diminishing returns and resources are better spent somewhere else, right? So on and so forth. So I really believe that my KPIs are my KRIs because they point to performance. They point to whether or not I am prioritizing well. But there isn't I don't like a framework. I like a lot of indicators. I like a lot of dials and knobs. I also am cognizant. Andy Ellis and I were on a panel once about metrics, and a lot of really smart people on that panel. And he said metrics are bunk, they're over politicized, and you're never going to report to your board of directors, red metrics, right, and so forth. I don't think that's totally true. I think that was Andy being Andy and a little bit of hyperbole, and he's much smarter than I am, and he's not wrong. He's just, I think there are people that do that, myself included. But I am cognizant that, there are what I call diagnostic measures and there are reportable metrics. These are both calculated efforts. They serve similar purposes, but different. And part of that is just the ability to manage and govern. I'm being very careful with my words there because the last thing you want to do is create a metric that shows that is inconsistent and report that and make it look like you don't know what you're doing. Last thing you want to do is create a metric that is aspirational. And so you're with thresholds and triggers that are aspirational and you're way beneath those and you want to report that out, make it look like this, because once you do, it becomes very, very important to get rid of the red, right?
Yeah.
Also,
so there are
measuring
diagnostics and measures that I keep for myself, and there are metrics that I report.
What was that, Jim?
Also, measuring the weather. I find a lot of metrics are measuring the weather. I always ask, executive teams that are using metrics, especially in security, when I was consulting, and my first question is how are you going to change the trajectory of that metric? What is in your power? What are the underlying? It could be a charter statement. It could be action plans, POAMs. It could be, technology implementations or deployments or whatever. Walk me through the top three that you plan on doing to change that trajectory? What controls do you have in place? And sadly, a lot of times it's like, well, and like, okay, well, then you're just measuring the weather, so why would you put your business, your career, your team at that kind of risk of interrogation when you're going to be good or bad depending on which way the wind blows? That's just not how you want to run. So.
I think, Jim, that's super important because I know, I think I still have the deck from the talk I gave that had good metrics and bad metrics. It was like B-sides Nashville a million years ago. But it was like I saw one chart a customer put on once and showed me, and I was like, oh crap. And it was literally like time, number of vulnerabilities, and it was doing this. And it was I'm like, hey, so it's going, you start really high, you start going down, it spikes up really high, it starts dribbling down again, it spikes up higher, it keeps like, what is that saying? And he's like, well, there's a lot of factors to this. And if I would have known the term that back then, I would have said, you're measuring the weather. And really what they were saying was, hey, we added some new systems from this acquisition we did, but it was not adequately explained. So you put that in front of a real leader, somebody understands. Really like, what are you failing? Like, what are you sitting on your hands? Like, what's happening here? Why is this going up?
Yeah, that's exactly what Alice was saying, is if you don't know how the board is interpreting or executive leadership is interpreting information, and I think even if you can control it, putting yourself down here, the target up here, and you're heading in that trajectory to look like you're improving or whatever you're doing, you'll be held so tight to that, it'll choke you to death if you're not careful.
Yeah. That was always one of my first jobs when we were doing the DBIR, because I came on board for the second one, was actually to go to the marketing team and say, okay, this is how you're going to present data and information. Like, no more pie charts, right? That people don't like pie charts. This is how we need to tell the story using metrics and numbers. And it's very important how we tell that story. It's not marketing. It's closer to science than marketing. And I literally had to put together a style guide for data representation for this huge multinational marketing department. So you'll play by our rules when you do the layouts and the graphics for the DBIR.
That's interesting. Mm-hmm. All right, Alex. I think we've taken up enough of your time. I appreciate it. That's 43 minutes well spent. Anything you want to leave people with?
No, thank you. I appreciate the opportunity to voice my opinion. I wouldn't say it if I didn't think it was important, but I do think that we're now on a point where, collectively as a vocation, we can start to think a little differently, and not just about AI is here or whatever.
Yeah,
but like how we go about doing our jobs.
Well, because that puts us in that like work about work section. If we spend too much time there, you're not actually getting anything done, right? It's like
you're worrying about the weather.
I heard a great analogy. Just to close, I heard a great analogy, and somebody said that really high performing security teams aren't like the Formula One pit crew. They're like the entire team, because you've got the driver by themselves can't win the race. The pit crew by themselves, even if they're fast, can't win the race. Both have to work in concert. Both have to be well-oiled. And you have to practice the things that, like how to change tires really fast, not at race time, off the track. So when it comes to the race day, you already know. This is like your work about work. You already know during your 9 to 5 or your scheduled work time what the work that is required to be done, and you're doing it as effectively as possible. Then you've got some team that's watching it from the sidelines going, that person can move another inch that way and it would decrease my stop time by 0.1 seconds, right? But we haven't, at least I haven't seen it. We haven't seen our profession move towards that sort of level of stratified expertise with outside observer and this 3-layer model. Thanks for reminding me about how this works. I remember that I was in finance for a bit. This is great. There's a ton of data that you put in front of us. Great bunch of learnings. I hope it doesn't take a bunch of more years to have you back, especially now that you are in an ability to both speak for yourself and join us on camera. That's fantastic. So I wish you a good rest of your week. Thanks for joining us. and may we live in uninteresting times.
Yes, may we live in uninteresting times. Thank you very much for having me.
All right, folks, this has been another awesome episode of the Down to Security Rabbit Hole podcast. Thanks for making us your go-to place to listen. Alex Hutton has been a fantastic guest. I will get him back, and it won't be another 1,000 episodes before he comes back. So thanks for listening. We'll catch you guys another time, another place, on another great episode of the Down to Security Rabbit Hole podcast. So long, everybody. Thanks for listening. Bye-bye.
This is Bella. Thanks for listening. Don't forget to leave my dad a review and share this with your friends. Bye.